On March 13th, 2020, Caleb's school announced that it would be closing for the rest of the year due to the outbreak of COVID-19. In the beginning, Caleb was ecstatic about not having to go to school, but as the weeks turned into months, he realized that school was far more bearable than being isolated at home. Caleb was an only child, with practically no real friends. At school, he had some classmates that he was somewhat acquainted with, but once the lockdown began, he lost contact with everybody. He felt like a prisoner, sentenced to solitary confinement, with his mind slowly degenerating as the days passed. By the end of the summer, Caleb's loneliness manifested itself in the form of depression, and he was in a constant state of apathy, despair, and agony. He tried to remain confident, and he believed that his depression would be cured once the world finally went back to normal. The more he spent without talking to another human being, the less optimistic he was. The more his mental health deteriorated. At the beginning of the lockdown, he would reassure his confidence by repeating corny phrases like, "Everything would be alright," and "hang in there." But by the time the weather began to cool down, the mantra had become, "I hate myself and I want to die." By the time December came around, Caleb's depression was so severe that he was unable to get out of bed. His heart, which was once filled with love and hope, had become corrupted with hate. He hated the world, for it was filled with suffering and despair. He hated how lonely he was, how much he would give just to have a conversation with another person. He hated how comfortable he was in his own mind. He could stare at the wall for hours, thinking about nothing, and at the same time, thinking about everything. What Caleb hated the most was his nihilism. That no matter how hard he tried, how much he looked, he couldn't find a reason that made his life worth living. Caleb believed that his and all life was meaningless, and the only reason he was put on this earth was to suffer. He joked to himself, "I would kill myself if I had the energy to get out of bed." And that was the first time the horrid idea of suicide became a serious consideration for Caleb. He would spend the next couple of weeks contemplating the idea of taking his own life. Then one night, his depression became so unbearable that he decided that suicide was the only choice he had. He grabbed his phone and checked the date, December 22nd, 2020, the day that I die. The truth was, Caleb didn't want to die. All of his instincts were forcing him to keep fighting and find meaning, but his demons were far more powerful. He spent the next hour thinking about his life. He tried to think about all the good moments, like when he was a child, filled with curiosity and wonder, until his innocence was ruined by the traumatic reality of this cold world. He thought about his best friend Henry, and how good life was when they would spend all day in the park and all night playing video games. Then he remembered Henry's funeral. And he remembered Henry's mother crying hysterically as his coffin was lowered into the ground. Caleb wondered if his own mother would cry hysterically like Henry's mom did. Of course she would, he thought to himself. And the thought of Caleb's mother losing her only son weighed heavily on his conscience. Caleb felt so guilty for his decision, but he believed that this was the only way he would find peace. Caleb cried out, "Please help me, God," as if he was on his deathbed with a terminal illness, as if suicide wasn't his choice. Unfortunately, Caleb's cries gone unheard, and that night, Caleb died. Caleb found himself in a complete state of nothingness, and he had become nothing but consciousness that was aware of itself. The awareness completely forgot every concept of life. It forgot that it was just embodied in a boy named Caleb living on planet Earth. At first, the consciousness believed that it was in a complete state of nothingness, but after further observation, it realized that it was infinity. Every atom in existence, every being in the universe, and everything that has ever happened was all one with this consciousness. As it explored itself, it discovered the positive energy within itself. It felt love, happiness, and ecstasy. And the consciousness knew that it was familiar with these feelings, but didn't quite understand how it knew these emotions. The consciousness looked further into itself and found the feelings of pain and suffering. From its perspective, These negative and positive feelings were all one, rather than being juxtaposed from each other. Then after some time of exploring the consciousness, it finally remembered that it was a boy named Caleb. And then it remembered the fatal situation that it was just in. The consciousness immediately began feeling regret about its decision. And once it felt regret, Caleb immediately regained his ego and found himself back in his bed. Never had Caleb been so grateful for his life than he did after that brief moment of experiencing death. At first, he was disappointed in himself because he knew that moments ago he transcended into a realm of great divinity and infinite knowledge, and the only concept that he was able to grasp from his experience was a realization of his fear of death. Then he gained a feeling of humbleness, for he knew that there was a great power that had the capability to transcend his ego. Caleb didn't know if what he experienced was heaven, the Tao, the great void, or maybe he was in the midst of a psychotic break. Whatever it was, it completely changed Caleb's perspective on life. Although he was still an isolated and depressed person, the difference now was that Caleb had hope towards life. He knew no matter how difficult his life would get, he would always shoulder the burden of his suffering and continue on. It didn't matter if he had terrible mental health. It didn't matter that the world was riddled with diseases. And even if the world fell into an apocalypse, Caleb would always fight to survive until the fate of the universe decides that it is his time to go. Caleb had undergone a complete transformation of his psyche, and he finally found meaning in his life. He knew that the infinity he felt was in himself. Therefore, Caleb was an infinite being, full of potential and capable of anything. He felt analogous to a hero on his journey, a hero that had gone into the depths of the underworld and returned righteous and victorious. He had been completely dismantled and torn apart in the depths of chaos, but it was essential for his psychological transformation. In order for him to let go of his nihilism, Caleb had to die and then was born again. He knew that sometimes, in order to keep your head above water, every now and then you must let go of certain parts of your identity. Whether it may be an unattractive quality, maybe you believed that it was essential to who you are, or maybe it's because it's preventing you from fulfilling your full potential. Sometimes life will put you in the chaos and in the unknown, and as long as you have faith, you will come out a better person than you were before. When you surrender all of your desires to a sovereign power, you will find yourself in a state of timelessness and infinite peace beyond description. And then finally, you have let your ego death.